everyone. Hi. Uh, well, it's August 1st, and we felt that it was important for us to help you understand this latest indictment against former President Donald Trump. And we have a special guest tonight, Peter Baker, who is an incredible reporter. Thank you so much.
I apologize. I'm so techno. I don't know what I'm
Oh,
doing.
please don't worry. Honestly, you are incredibly nice to hop on this Instagram live because, as I said, you're a very busy guy and you've got probably, gosh, I don't know how you would rate this. Is this one of the biggest stories that you've covered in your career? I mean, and how do you figure out what day of that big story is the most important? But tell us, I'm going to close the comments. Someone asked us, but please, you all, if you have questions, just write them in the questions section. So, Peter, obviously, you've just put your story for tomorrow's paper to bed, or I guess it's online now. You just wrapped it up. Thank you again for being here. What's your headline tomorrow, Peter?
Yeah, the headline is, well, let's see what they write. I can see it. It says, Trump's case has broad implications for American democracy. And I think the point that we're trying to make with this piece is it's an analysis piece that goes with our main news story. And the point is that, yeah, okay, it's only the third indictment, but in fact, this is the one that really matters most, right? That we're finally at the heart of the matter. Not to say that hush money and classified documents are important. They are, obviously, but this is the one that really gets at the heart of our system. What we're really testing here is, can a sitting president spread lies and use the levers of government to hold on to power after the voters say, no, you're done? And that's so fundamental to the American democracy, the experiment that we've been undergoing for these last 2 centuries. That's why I think it's sort of tops the previous stories we've been covering, because there's such a consequence to it.
Let's talk about the four counts: conspiracy, and maybe you can just help us understand what they each mean. Yeah. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. What is that referring to exactly?
I mean, in effect, what Jack Smith, the special counsel, is saying here is that Trump tried to perpetrate a giant fraud on the American public by telling them that the election was stolen, when not only wasn't it stolen, he knew, Jack Smith says, it wasn't stolen. And he had every reason to know. And the indictment lays out all the different ways that Trump was told time and again that the assertions he was making, the claims he was making, were not, in fact, true. They were, in fact, conspiracy blank, called down from the mothership, as one of his own senior advisors put it. And the point is that he was defrauding the public. He was defrauding America on this most important thing, which is, who we choose for our leaders.
His supporters argued, and I was sort of flipping around cable channels because I'm always fascinated to see how Fox News, for example, covers this versus CNN and MSNBC. And their claim was, well, this is free speech. He had a right to say this. This is what he believed at the time. Tell us how the indictment counters that argument, Peter.
Yeah, Jack Smith in the indictment very directly takes it on. He says, look, even on page 2, he says, look, yes, he has a free speech right to say what he wants to say. That doesn't give him the right to try to actually overturn an election. It's one thing to complain, to whine, to moan, to say, I lost, I shouldn't have lost, I was cheated, even if it wasn't true. But what he did, Jack Smith is saying, goes far beyond that. He tried to, in fact, perpetrate a fraud by pressing state officials, by pressing his own Justice Department, by pressing his own vice president to actually reverse the results of the election, even though he knew, Jack Smith says, that his claims were false. And this goes to an interesting point, because there has been this debate. Well, did he have a well-founded, or at least a good faith belief that maybe, in fact, something wrong happened? He was simply availing himself of his opportunities to change what he thought was an unfair result. And Jack Smith says, no, there's just no evidence that he actually believed this, Jack Smith says, because you can tell his own attorney general, his own vice president, his own campaign advisors, his own family, honestly, I don't know if they put this in the indictment, all knew that this was not true, and were telling him time and time again. And yet he would go out and repeat specific claims that he had already been told by his own people, not by Democrats, but by Republicans, were not true. And he went ahead and put them out there anyway.
He also, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. That, of course, was the process of certifying the election that was about to take place on Capitol Hill.
Exactly right. He tried, of course, through his lieutenants to create these fake electors and to send those electors to Washington so that Congress and/or the vice president could say, well, let's pick these electors instead of the ones that were actually chosen by the voters and certified by governors and all these states. And of course, the counting of those votes in the Capitol on January 6th was obstructed by mobs of people storming through the Capitol who were instigated, Jack Smith is saying, by President Trump's speech on the ellipse and by months of lies, not just that one speech that one day, but they were inspired by the things he was telling them about this election.
Obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. That sounds very much like the other one I just read, Peter.
Yeah, I think those are basically the same in effect. I mean, it's the creation of these fake electors and then the counting of the actual electors on January 6th at the Capitol. These are official acts. They're called for by law and the Constitution, and to try to impede them the way he did, the prosecutor is saying constitutes a crime.
Conspiracy against rights.
Well, that means basically he's defrauding or conspiring to deprive voters of their franchise, right? He is disqualifying, in effect, he's disenfranchising millions of Americans who voted for Joe Biden by having their votes tossed out in favor of fake electors who represented the smaller number of voters who voted for him in these battleground states. So in effect, what Jack Smith is saying here is you are disenfranchising millions of voters. You're taking away their civil rights, their rights to vote, because you're throwing away their votes and telling Congress to give the Electoral College votes to you instead of the person that they picked.
Let's talk about the 3 of the 4 counts, Peter, have the word conspiracy in them. And 6 unnamed co-conspirators are part of this indictment. Is the New York Times reporting who they are at this point? Because there's been a lot of speculation that they include people like Sidney Powell, the lawyer who was basically the mouthpiece for this fraudulent election claim, Rudy Giuliani, who was very much part of this team, and there were others, I think 5 out of the 6 lawyers. So what can you tell us about that, and can you explain what that means exactly?
Yeah, in order to charge a conspiracy, you have to charge more than one person, right? You can't conspire by yourself. You have to conspire with other people. So what Jack Smith is saying in this indictment is these are the other conspirators. Now, it's interesting that those other conspirators are not themselves charged today. Now, what does that mean? We don't know yet. Does that mean he's going to charge them in the future? Presumably, that's the obvious suspicion. It may be that he thinks some of them are going to turn witness against the president. That's a possibility, I suppose.
Right.
But in any case, in order to lodge this count, he needed to say he did have co-conspirators, and these are the 5 or 6 people that he has. I'm not sure whether we officially named them in our coverage, but I think everybody more or less agrees that, it's Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell. This campaign advisor seems to be, I think, Jason Miller. A lot of these things are you could easily square away by existing, information that came out from the January 6th committee in Congress or whatever. So you could tell from the indictment, because it says, co-conspirator X said this. Well, we already know that so-and-so said that because of the previous investigation. So it's pretty easy, I think, to narrow down who these are.
Wasn't Rudy Giuliani called on to testify? And wasn't there speculation that he had flipped already?
There was, and he's denied it. He said he hasn't. So we don't know, obviously, that this indictment doesn't tell us one way or the other. But there's an interesting other one I thought that I was reading for. I was looking for Mark Meadows in this because there's a lot of speculation about where he has. Of course, Mark Meadows is the last White House chief of staff for President Trump. He was part and parcel of all of this stuff. He was with him on that phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State. He literally flew down to Georgia himself. He was coordinating with the members of Congress about how to reject the Electoral College votes. He was getting texts and sending texts all over the place about how to plan for these fake electors and to get the Justice Department to investigate and declare that there was something wrong. And yet his name is not among, apparently, the co-conspirators. Why is that? Everybody's been wondering, has he flipped? And that's an interesting question.
Absolutely. I don't want to necessarily have you get into sort of the criminal justice code that was used, but one was Section 1512. that corrupt obstruction, well, we have that. Both are provisions of Section 1512. Any conviction under that statute is punishable by up to 20 years in prison.
Yeah, these are serious charges, right? And any one of these could put him in prison by itself. And obviously, you put that on top of the other cases he's already got against him, then you've got a former president who's looking at a lot of possible jail time. What's interesting about these charges, of course, is that we don't have a statute on the books that says a president shouldn't cheat to hold on to power, right? We don't have something that is directly on point. So what he has had to do, the prosecutor Jack Smith, is to try to figure out what statutes would apply in this circumstance. And that's kind of going to be a novel argument. And you can see how that may, involve some appeals and some higher level courts to try to say, does this apply correctly? Because it's in some ways a first time we've ever charged a president with this kind of stuff. Of course, does it fit the facts? And that's going to be, I think, part of the legal fight.
Yeah, and in fact, one is Section 241 that was enacted by Congress after the Civil War to go after Southern whites, including members of the KKK who used terrorism to prevent formerly enslaved African Americans from voting. But in a series of 20th century cases, the Supreme Court upheld expanding use of this statute to election fraud conspiracies like ballot box stuffing. So this is what Jack Smith ostensibly used to go to the grand jury with this, right?
Right, and just because a statute's been on the books for a long time doesn't mean it's not still valid, right? It hasn't been repealed, and as long as it's in use, it doesn't matter what it was originally put on the books for if it applies. Another of the statutes he's using, of course, is one that has been used on a lot of the January 6th defendants, which is, of course, is the obstructing with an official proceeding. That's already now been
1512, right, Peter? Well, that's
you're
okay.
the lawyer. I'm not.
No, I'm not a lawyer. No, I'm not a lawyer. But you're right.
I would hire you as my lawyer. But I think that well, it has been obviously tested in this particular circumstance, right? And a number of judges obviously have gone ahead with that and said, yes, that's an appropriate use in this circumstance. So you could presume that that has a stronger basis in this circumstance too.
Some lawyers say a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, but what is the significance that this grand jury in the nation's capital delivered this indictment or handed down this indictment?
Well, there's something symbolic, of course, about it, right? A grand jury in the nation's capital, in effect, is speaking for the country. This is not like New York State, which is talking about its own business, document laws and all that. This is the Justice Department of the United States with a grand jury in the nation's capital saying that in our democracy, this is not permissible. This is criminal activity. So there is that sort of symbolic statement. There's also the very practical statement, which is not good for Donald Trump, which is that it's in the District of Columbia, unlike the classified documents case, which apparently is going to be heard by a court in Florida, where President Trump won the election and he has a lot of supporters. He did not have a lot of supporters in the city of Washington, D.C. I think he only got about 5% of the vote in 2020. So you could presume this is going to be a jury filled with people who are at least skeptical of him, to say the least.
Let's talk about Mike Pence's role in this upcoming trial, Peter. He issued a statement that said, today's indictment, serves as an important reminder. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. Our country is more important than one man. Our Constitution is more important than any one man's career. You can juxtapose that with Ron DeSantis' statement talking about how the Justice Department has been weaponized. This was a pretty strong statement by Mike Pence, and he perhaps is going to be a key witness in this case. Can you explain?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, right? Because in fact, on the previous two indictments, Mike Pence has been much more on Trump's side, talking about how unfair all this was, and it's just politics. He didn't say that in this statement. He did, in fact, seem to suggest that even if he wasn't endorsing the indictment, that there's something very important at stake here, and that a president cannot simply toss the Constitution aside in order to stay in power. Mike Pence, of course, is a key player because he was the one who was under pressure from Donald Trump all the way up until January 6th to try to use some theoretical power that Trump said the vice president had to discount states that voted for Biden when the Electoral College votes were being counted on the Hill. Of course, the vice president is the president of the Senate, and under the Constitution acts specifically as the presiding officer when the Congress meets in order to count the Electoral College votes. And then Vice President Pence said all along to Trump, no, I don't have that power, and no reasonable lawyer would say that I do. Nothing in the Constitution suggests that I could single-handedly change the results of these states' when there's no clear dispute and there's no clear reason to, certainly. And he has been, steadfast in holding by that position ever since. He's never, even as he's been kind of soft on Trump for other reasons, he's never, backed down on that. And so you're right. He could be called to trial. He could be asked to testify. It would be interesting to see if he did, whether that happens. And these two running mates having split in a way that is pretty dramatic.
Yeah, what an interesting turn of events that would be. But could Trump blame this on the so-called co-conspirators, that he was listening to them and following their lead in terms of making these claims that the election was rigged, and then, basically telling people, and including Mike Pence, but also his followers, to disrupt the proceedings?
I mean, he basically does that in one of his statements today, in the statement that his campaign puts out. They basically say he was following the advice of lawyers. Now, it doesn't say the next step, which is that he simply wouldn't have done it if the lawyers hadn't told him. It's not like he has said, oh, gosh, I was fooled, right? He still stands by his position that somehow the election was stolen. He's as vociferous about that today as he's ever been. And he has said, of course, that he doesn't really care much about the Constitution. People have paid less attention to one of the statements he made after the election that I think is pretty important. He called at one point for the termination of the Constitution. That's his word, termination of the Constitution, in order to take Biden out of office right now and put him, Trump, back in. So this is not somebody who is simply, trying to abide by the Constitution. He has said he doesn't care much for the Constitution if it gets in the way of his goal of being back in power.
What do we know about this judge, Judge Chutkan, Tanya Chutkan? I know that she was confirmed to her judgeship by a vote of 95-0. Neil Katyal, who speaks to me a lot on these matters, says she has a criminal defense background, serving as a public defender for years, and is known as fair-minded to all, he said. What have you heard or read or learned about her?
I don't know much about her. I know she's an Obama appointee. Obviously, that's a contrast to Florida, where Judge Cannon, who's hearing the classified documents case, is a Trump appointee. In theory, it shouldn't matter which president picks you as a judge. The judge is supposed to be, fair and impartial, regardless of the political origin of their appointment. But as we've seen in recent years, at the very least, it causes questions to be raised. People wonder, can this judge be fair in a political case like this? So we'll have to see. This will be a new character on the stage, if you will. We'll see how she handles the proceedings as they advance at this point. But it's a big case, obviously, and her role is going to be critical.
And a lot of it, I was interesting when Jack Smith gave his statement. He said he emphasized a speedy trial. And someone asked in the question section, what are the chances of this going to trial before the election?
Yeah, and it's hard to know. I mean, it's at this point, how easy it is to delay these things. We've seen that time and again. The classified documents case is now scheduled for a trial next May, which would put it after most of the primaries that would basically decide who's going to be the Republican nominee, but before the convention and the general election. Could you get this trial to be any faster? I don't know. I mean, in some ways, the details are well known. The facts are out there. The truth is we've known most of the facts in this 45-page indictment, certainly since the January 6th committee wrapped up its work 7 months ago. And really a lot of them, frankly, even before that, because he did all this in public. It wasn't even hidden. It was, it was very, very open and overt. But that doesn't mean it can't be delayed. And I think that this raises legal questions in particular that you can imagine would delay things. Could a vice president, for instance, like Pence, be required to testify? Does he have any kind of immunity? He didn't end up resisting in the end, testifying for the grand jury. So does that mean that there's already a decision made in effect that would affect the trial? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I can only imagine that this could take a long time. And the question is whether it could be done before the election. You would think the voters would have a right to have this resolved, at least at the trial level, before the election, so that they can make a judgment based on it.
And we're talking to Peter Baker from the New York Times. Peter, I wanted to ask you about the political sort of ramifications of that. The New York Times ran that poll recently that showed that Donald Trump was way ahead when it comes to securing the Republican nomination. I think ahead of Ron DeSantis by about 37 points, I believe, and that it's his for the taking in essence, and that many people, even those who believed he had committed crimes were still supporting him.
Yeah.
So, do you think this is going to change any hearts and mind, particularly among those in the hardcore MAGA base?
Is a really good question. I mean, the short answer is we shouldn't expect it to if history is any guide, because each of the last two indictments, people thought, well, this is the one that really may affect people's view of him, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, they didn't. In fact, his numbers, at least within the Republican Party, went up. 74% in our poll said that they think he was simply exercising legitimate efforts to contest the election and he didn't do anything wrong in effect on January 6th. So 3/4 of Republicans have already decided that. Among the people in the Republican base who we consider to be the MAGA base, which is about 37% of the party, these are hardcore MAGA voters, our poll found that not a single one of the people we surveyed, out of 319 people, not one person thought that he had committed any kind of crimes to this point on any of these issues. So you're right. They've already sort of made up their mind in a lot of ways. They need to read the indictment. We'll see whether the progress of all this, the highlighting of all this, the weight of so many different legal issues might eventually start to wear him down. You got to wonder if he's got now 3 trials going to come up criminally. He's already got a civil trial coming up in the fall. He's got other civil cases coming up. He's already had a civil case that he lost on a sexual assault, basically to E. Jean Carroll, $5 million verdict. His company, Trump organization, already been found guilty in a criminal trial of 17 felonies. You would think after all of this, at some point, it might begin to kind of wear down a political candidate. When you and I were growing up, that certainly wasn't a recipe for political success. But we're in a different era right now, and he's a different character.
And if you do look at the way Fox is covering this, Jesse Waters was saying they were using obscure federal statutes. This is going to give Donald Trump what he wants, a chance to relitigate the 2020 elections. And he called the judge an Obama-era judge with a nasty track record. And of course, the biggest claim is this is Joe Biden's Justice Department really trying to cripple his main rival, while they're calling into question Hunter Biden's behavior.
Right.
That has been the mantra in conservative media. I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, Peter, and this sort of tit for tat that's going on in terms of covering these things and the fact that it has been hopelessly politicized, it seems.
It has been, and it makes it really hard, right, to have any kind of faith in the system. That's the problem, is that he is deliberately and intentionally trying to erode faith in the system so that people won't believe that he did anything wrong. And look, it is an awkward and untenable in some ways innate feature of our system that the Justice Department is always going to be in the hands of a president from one party or the other. And you're always going to therefore have questions about, are they really dispensing justice in an impartial way, or are they doing the bidding of the president who happened to appoint the attorney general? It's worth remembering in this case that unlike President Trump, who when he was in office openly and repeatedly pressured his Justice Department to prosecute his enemies and to forgive his foes openly and repeatedly, Joe Biden has not said one word, certainly publicly, about any of these cases. And has, as far as we know, there's no evidence he has played any role whatsoever other than appointing Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, right? He's not sat there trying to determine who gets charged and who doesn't. Merrick Garland was so concerned about the appearances, understanding people's natural suspicions, that he appointed Jack Smith as a special counsel to give him at least some degree of autonomy, some degree of independence, to have somebody look at this who is not at least as directly a political appointee. But of course, a special counsel does still work for the Justice Department and the Attorney General. And if the Attorney General disagreed with his handling, the Attorney General could overrule him. So even then you could say, well, he's independent, but only sort of, right? It's not like right. Ken Starr or Larry Walsh during Iran-Contra or any of these others who were independent counsels that had a different statutory set up where they genuinely were independent of the Justice Department in a way that a special counsel is not. So it's built into the system that it seems people are going to ask questions automatically. But again, so far as we can tell, there's been no evidence that anybody has come forward with that there's been anything political about it other than just the appearance of it. Now, as for Hunter Biden, they're still prosecuting Hunter Biden. They are going to take his plea for crimes. They're not particularly significant crimes by comparison to what President Trump is charged with. And the question is whether they've gone easy on him. And there are some, IRS officials and others who are saying, gosh, we're hamstrung in this investigation. And those questions are going to have to be investigated more thoroughly. But let's keep in mind that, one thing is not necessarily like the other. Whatever has happened with Hunter Biden is not the president of the United States. He didn't try to overturn an election. He didn't, obstruct FBI investigation into classified documents and so on. So whatever Hunter Biden might have done and whatever accountability that there should be there for him doesn't mean that it's okay for President Trump to have done whatever it is he's charged with doing.
Real quickly, I'm just going to read what President Trump said when he released a short video response, Peter, which I'm sure you've seen. He said, they came at me from the left, they came at me from the right, the rhinos, the communists, the fascists. We will not only survive, but we'll be stronger than ever before. And then Donald Jr. tweeted, strange that if this indictment is so real and serious that it didn't happen 2.5 years ago. I wonder why that is. Apparently it happened now because Trump's polling is so strong. The swamp and the deep state will do anything to prevent him from winning and taking their power. Is this sort of typical Trump bravado? Do you think there is any actual concern in the Trump camp that this could mean that a former president would actually go to prison?
I think they're very concerned about that. Of course they are, because that's a political defense, not a legal defense, right? And it may be a very successful political defense, telling people, look, this is all partisan, it's all a witch hunt, and a lot of people, as we've seen from polls, believe that. That's different than when you get into court of law. What you had not heard from any of his statements made today, or frankly even before today, was any denial of the facts that are in the indictment. He doesn't deny any of them. He just simply says, I didn't do anything wrong. What I did was fine. You shouldn't call it a crime. But what he has been charged with, both in this indictment and in the other two, quite honestly, he has not really tried to dispute, at least as a factual matter. So what is your defense when you get into a court of law? That's going to look a little different than this, because I don't think, in a court of law, the whole, well, gosh, Hunter this and Joe Biden that is going to be the, I don't know how much you're allowed to bring that kind of thing into a courtroom, but I kind of imagine that that's not really the way a trial works.
And so his only defense is, I believe this was the case. I believe the election was rigged. I was speaking the truth. And is there anything else that his team will use to defend what he did?
Well, that's a good question, because they haven't yet told us anything that they would do. They've not produced any witnesses or kind of tried to make the argument, well, here's this person who tells you this. And in fact, all of the people who were cited in Jack Smith's indictment saying the opposite, that they told Trump that he lost, they told Trump that this conspiracy theory wasn't true or that allegation wasn't true, all of them are Republicans, and almost all of them people he himself hired or appointed. His own attorney generals, his own Justice Department officials, his own campaign advisors, his own vice president. So in other words, it's not a Democratic conspiracy. So when he sits there and says on the video, they came at me from the left and the right, in effect, what he's saying is, even Republicans that I hired are part of this great big conspiracy against me. And it's, we'll see how that plays.
Hey, in closing, before I let you go and go to bed, or at least have a drink, did you ever think, Peter, you would be covering a story like this? I mean, it's just wild, isn't it?
Oh, it's so wild. No, I never did. Did you? I mean, I don't know. You and I, we've been around a little while. We've covered some pretty remarkable things. But no, I could never have imagined this. And I think what's important to remember is how consequential it is. I think there's kind of an anticlimactic feeling sometimes in Washington today, like, oh, okay, well, we've been waiting for this for a while. Oh, okay, well, we knew this and that, and that's in the indictment and so forth. Whoa, wait, stop. Okay, yeah, we may have known this was coming, and we may have known some of the facts or even all of the facts in here, but this is a big deal. It's a big deal.
And Peter, we haven't even seen what's going to happen in Georgia.
Right, exactly. There's one more case. You can have a fourth indictment still to come. Georgia thinks, the prosecutors there seem to think anyway, that he violated their laws in terms of trying to overturn their election results. She says she's going to bring a case, or at least let us know it's going to happen, I think, sometime in the next few weeks. So we could be by Labor Day or shortly thereafter with 4 criminal cases against a former president.
Do you think that this trial will be televised so people can watch it or not?
That's a good question. It's not the Florida one, they've already said won't be, and I can't remember DC trials being televised in the federal court. I could be wrong. I would, I think we media organizations are all going to argue that it should be, right, in the interest of transparency and the great interest of the part of the public. But I don't know. I don't know.
By the way, this is ginger ale.
I take your word on it.
Peter Baker of the New York Times. Peter, really, thanks again for hopping on. Great to see you and talk to you, and looking forward to reading your piece tomorrow, or actually tonight.
Thank you,
Okay,
Katie. It's always great to be with you.
Thank you.
So much.
All right. Bye.